They left her to die in the desert, bound, bloodied, forgotten. June Carter had been sold by the one man who was supposed to protect her, her own father. He traded her for a poker debt like she was just another chip on the table. But fate, or perhaps mercy, wasn't done with her yet. Because the man who found her wasn't just a passing cowboy. He was a ghost from another war. A gunslinger hiding from his own name. And when he carried her out of that sandstorm, he didn't just rescue a woman, he awakened a fire that would burn through everything that tried to break her. The desert didn't whisper. It didn't cry. It didn't rage. It simply waited. And that made it cruel in a way most people couldn't understand. But Leandro Luke Donovan did. He'd ridden these canyons since he was 16, when his bones still grew faster than his sense of danger. But at 41, his silence had hardened into habit. He no longer cursed the sun or prayed for rain. He just rode each hoofbeat on the dust, a soft resignation to whatever came next. That day, something came. A scrap of white linen caught on a cactus spine, fluttering, stained. Luke reined in his horse. He slid off the saddle knees, cracking from age, and battles past, and stepped closer. The cloth was delicate, a woman's slip torn and crusted with what he feared was blood. The air around it was wrong, still, but not natural, like grief, trying to pretend it was just wind. Luke turned his eyes east, squinting against the haze. The ridge dipped toward a gully choked with mesquite. His horse snorted uneasy. Then he saw it. A pair of bare legs, bruised and dust-covered, slumped beneath the shadows of a dying tree. A woman. She was tied upright, wrists rubbed raw against a trunk thick with thorns. Her head lolled. Her dress, once pale blue, maybe hung in rags around her shoulders. Blood had dried in her hair, matted it against her scalp. Luke's breath left him like a punch to the chest, not from shock, but from memory. He didn't speak when he cut her down. Some things didn't need noise. His knife worked quick but gentle, each slice through rope made with reverence, not haste. When her body collapsed into his arms, it was light, too light, like she'd left most of herself behind somewhere in the sand. Her face was hidden beneath grime and bruises. But her lips moved. Not a word, just a sound, a breath still here. He wrapped her in his coat and carried her to the horse. She didn't flinch when he touched her. That terrified him more than if she had. His cabin lay a half-day north, nestled against red rock cliffs that the map didn't bother naming. He laid her on his cot, wiped the blood from her forehead, and let her sleep. She didn't wake for 2 days. Luke stayed near, speaking only when necessary, mostly to the fire or the dog that wasn't really his. He boiled water, cooked rice. He watched her chest rise and fall with the silence of a man who'd buried too many things to trust in resurrection. When she stirred, it wasn't sudden. Her eyes opened the way a door does when it's been shut for years, slowly with resistance and the creak of fear in every blink. She tried to sit. Luke held up a hand. "You're safe," he said, voice gravel and molasses. "Ain't nobody here but me and the wind." She swallowed hard. Her mouth opened then closed. She looked toward the door, toward escape. "You were left out there to die," Luke said. "Figured you'd rather not finish the job." Her eyes flicked to his. Sharp. Testing. Then hoarse and cracked, she asked, "Why'd you bring me back?" He didn't answer right away. Because that was the question that stuck, wasn't it? In his bones. In the lines around his eyes. In the ache between silence and salvation. Finally, he said, "You were breathing." By nightfall, she sat upright with a blanket around her shoulders and asked for water. Her hands trembled, knuckles purple with healing bruises. Luke handed her the cup without a word. "Your name?" she asked. He hesitated. Then Donovan. "Most call me Luke." She studied him. You don't talk much. No need. A ghost of a smile curled the corner of her mouth. Just a twitch, but it was real. I'm June, she said. June Carter. Luke nodded. The name sat in the air like a memory someone left on the porch too long. I suppose she continued. You want to know what happened? He shrugged. Only if you want to say it. Her eyes lowered to the cup in her hand. The reflection stared back at her, not the bruises, but the woman beneath them. My father owed a man, she said. Cards, whiskey, a girl or two. Her jaw tightened. I was one of the chips on the table. Luke felt his grip tighten around the wooden chair. June went on quiet now, as if telling the story to herself more than to him. He traded me to pay the debt. No apology, no explanation. Just, it's the only way I live, June. She laughed, a dry, broken sound. He didn't even ask if I wanted to die instead. Luke looked at her, really looked. You don't have to say more, he offered. But June shook her head. If I don't, I'll carry it alone. And so she told him about the saloon in El Paso, the man who owned her like a broken horse. The nights that didn't end, the silence she wore like armor the moment they thought she'd died, and dumped her body out in the desert like yesterday's garbage. When she finished, the cabin was quiet. Even the fire stopped crackling, as if it too was listening. Luke stood slowly, took her cup, refilled it. I'm not your savior, he said. Rough. I don't want to be. I didn't ask for one. Good, he nodded. But you can stay. Long as you need. No man'll come for you here. If he does. His eyes narrowed. The kind of quiet promise that doesn't need volume. June stared at the fire for a long while. Then, in a voice smaller than before, You believe a person can start over. Luke didn't smile, but his voice softened. Out here, the desert don't lie. It strips you down, shows you what's real. But sometimes, he paused, sometimes it lets things grow again too. She didn't cry. She just leaned back into the pillow, eyes still open, for the first time not looking for the door. The rain started as a whisper, brushing gently against the tin roof of the cabin, like it didn't mean to disturb anyone. Inside, Leandro sat by the wood-burning stove, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, steam curling past the brim. The woman in his bed hadn't spoken in nearly 12 hours. She lay facing the wall, her back rigid, her hands tucked under her chin like a child who had long since learned not to cry. Her name, he'd gathered, was June. But the way she held herself quiet, braced against the world, told him she didn't expect to keep that name much longer. Women who'd been sold off rarely did. He didn't push her. Not with questions. Not with touch. There were things you didn't ask someone whose soul had been chewed up and spit out by men with no conscience. The kind of men who shuffled cards with one hand and held a woman's throat with the other. But that night, as thunder rolled low across the hills and the fire popped soft like bones cracking, she spoke. Do you know what it feels like? She said, her voice no louder than breath, to watch your own father trade you away like he's settling a bar tab. Leandro looked up but didn't move. He said I was lucky, she continued, that I should be grateful. At least the man who won the hand wasn't a stranger. Said it like that made it better. June turned to face the room, her eyes hollow but steady. Her lips were split, one side darkened where someone's ring had found her cheek. Yet even in that wreckage, her gaze was proud. I stood there, in that smoke-choked saloon, and he pointed at me like I was a lamb too old for the market. Take her, he said. That should cover it. Leandro didn't answer. He knew the weight of silence when it was sacred. But I wasn't the debt, she said. I was just easy to give away. Earlier that week, June's father, Ray Carter, a man known more for his drinking than his gambling sense, had walked into the Silver Nail Saloon in El Paso, with $3 a wedding ring that didn't belong to him and his only daughter trailing behind. He'd lost it all before midnight. When Rigo Almaraz leaned back in his chair, eyes like wet coal, and smiled, June said she felt it before he spoke. That slow, simmering dread. That cold truth a woman learns just before her name becomes a transaction. "You'll hand over the girl," Rigo said, fanning the deck lazily. "And we'll call it even." Ray only blinked, then looked at his hand 3 aces, and laughed like the devil had just kissed his boots. "She ain't worth more than the trouble she causes." Ray muttered, standing up without even glancing her way. "But if you want her, she's yours." June didn't cry, didn't scream. She just remembered the smell of whiskey and sweat, and the way Rigo's men grabbed her arms like she wasn't someone's daughter, like she wasn't even a person. Back in the cabin, Leandro stirred the fire with a bent poker. "I ever tell you about my mother?" he asked, eyes fixed on the flames. "She worked the washrooms behind a train depot in Kansas. Used to say the only thing dirtier than the men's boots was their promises." June looked at him, her expression unreadable. Came home one night, her dress torn, one cheek bruised blue. I asked who did it. She said, "The kind of man who only sees what he can take." He paused. Next day she packed us up, and we left town in the dark. "What happened to her?" June asked. Leandro let the silence hang a second too long. She didn't get far enough. They didn't speak after that. Not for a while. But in the hush that followed a new thread wound between them. Not quite trust. Not yet forgiveness. But something like the first soft breath after you've been drowning. The next morning, June found Leandro outside, mending a fence as the dawn stretched its fingers over the hills. She watched him from the porch, watched the way he tied the wire, how his hands, scarred and steady, knew exactly what pressure would hold and what would break. "You're not like the others," she said suddenly. He didn't turn. "I don't mean just the men who hurt me," she added. "I mean even the ones who tried to help. They looked at me like I was already ruined, like they were doing me a favor by pretending I wasn't." Leandro wiped his hands on a cloth. "I ain't pretending anything," he said. "I just don't think you're what he said you were." "Who your father?" June laughed, sharp and bitter. "That man never said a true thing in his life, except when he told me I'd never be free. You believe that I did." And now she looked up. The light was soft on her face, showing every bruise, but also every line of strength. "I'm not sure yet," she whispered. "But last night, when you sat outside my door, I didn't feel like prey. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel hunted." Leandro tipped his hat, not a gesture of charm, but of respect. "You're safe here," he said. "No one gets to lay claim on you again." June's voice broke. "Then why does it still feel like I belong to him?" He didn't answer, but he walked over, slowly knelt before her, not to touch her, not to offer some hollow comfort, but simply to be lower, to let her see that she wasn't beneath anyone. "That feeling'll fade," he said. "Not quick, not clean, but it will." That night, June folded her old dress and placed it on the fire. It curled in the flames like something that had waited too long to die. Leandro didn't ask why. She watched it burn and said almost to herself, "He gave me away." But he never got to name who I'd become. And when the last thread turned to ash, she turned to Leandro and asked, "Do you have a mirror?" He nodded. "Then tomorrow," she said, "I'd like to see myself again." The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows on the rough-planked walls. Outside, the wind combed the hills of the high desert, making the shutters creak like old bones. June lay on the cot beneath a wool blanket that smelled of smoke and horse sweat. She stared at the ceiling with her hands folded flat over her chest as still as a photograph yellowing in the sun. Leandro didn't speak. He sat in the corner with a tin mug in his hand, watching her in the way a man watches a wounded animal, gentle, distant, hoping not to frighten it back into itself. For 2 days, she hadn't said a word. She ate what he left by the bedside, half a biscuit, here a mouthful of beans there. She drank the tea, but never touched the coffee. She slept, but not deeply. Every now and then her legs would twitch like she was still trying to run even in sleep. Leandro knew that look. He'd seen it in soldiers too young to shave. He'd seen it in the eyes of women too proud to scream, and he knew better than to force it. But that night, something shifted. He was trimming the wick on the oil lamp when her voice broke the silence. "Do you ever forget?" He looked up. Her eyes were still on the ceiling. "Forget what?" he asked, voice low. "Faces, voices, the way people used to look at you before they learned to hate you." Leandro set the lamp down carefully. "No," he said. "I remember all of them, even the ones who smiled when they sold me out." She nodded, once slow. "My father used to call me Chiquita before the whiskey took the last of his kindness." Her voice had no tremble, no softness. Just fact. "I used to think if I was quiet enough, good enough, he'd go back to calling me that." She finally turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were dry, bone dry. That was the part that scared him. "I didn't cry," she whispered. "Not when he lost me to that card table. Not when they dragged me into the wagon. Not even when they put me in the dirt like I was already dead." She blinked, slow and deliberate. "I think the tears just burned off." Leandro leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't owe the world your tears, June." Her mouth twitched at the corner. Not a smile. Something bitterer. "They don't want your tears anyway. They want your silence, your body, your name, but not your pain." There was a long pause between them, thick, full of unsaid things. Then she sat up slowly, wincing as her ribs shifted. "Do you have a Bible?" He raised an eyebrow. "Somewhere. Haven't cracked it open in years." "Good." "I don't need sermons," she said. "I just want to hear the names. The begets. The women who got written out." Leandro chuckled softly, half in disbelief. "Most folks ask for whiskey. You ask for forgotten women." "I am a forgotten woman," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I just want to remember I came from somewhere." He stood up, crossed to the shelf above the hearth, and pulled down an old black Bible with a cracked spine. He flipped it open until he found the long, winding lineage of men and their sons, and the occasional mother barely mentioned. June leaned her back against the wall, arms crossed, listening. "Judah begat Perez and Zerah by Tamar." He read slowly. June closed her eyes. "Tamar," she repeated, "left by a man, lied to, dressed like a harlot so she could claim what was hers." She opened her eyes, and this time they were glistening. He kept reading. "Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab." June's voice was quieter now. She was a prostitute, but she hid spies, saved lives, became mother to kings. A single tear broke free and traced her cheek. She didn't brush it away. She turned to him. Her voice came like wind through old canyon walls. "They only remember our names when we bleed into their stories." Leandro closed the Bible. "Then maybe it's time someone told yours." Silence again. But this time it wasn't hollow. It was full, like the stillness after a storm, when the earth hasn't yet realized it can breathe. After a moment, June reached for the worn edge of the blanket, fingers shaking. Not from fear, from release. "I haven't said her name in years," she murmured. "Who's my mother?" "Elena." Her voice cracked on the second syllable. "She used to sing while she braided my hair. Long songs. Songs her mother sang in Spanish, with words I didn't understand, but still felt. Leandro looked at her carefully. "Sing it," he said. I forgot the tune. "Then hum it." She did. It was broken, uneven, lost in places. But it filled the room in a way no sermon ever could. It curled into the corners around the fire, into the cracks in the wall. It made the cabin feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. When she stopped, he was still listening. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For not asking me to cry." He nodded slowly. "I'll never ask, but if it comes, I'll sit with you through it." She looked down at her lap, her fingers curled together. "I don't know who I am anymore." Leandro leaned back, hands folded across his chest. "You're not what they did to you." Her eyes snapped up. "You hear me," he said again, firmer this time. "You're not what they did to you." She nodded. Once. Twice. Like she was trying to make herself believe it. And in the quiet, where only the wind outside knew what either of them carried June Rivas, the girl who wouldn't cry closed her eyes. And this time, when a tear fell, it didn't burn. It healed. The wind had a memory to it that morning. It moved through the juniper trees behind the cabin slow and low, like it remembered something the rest of the world had tried to forget. The fire in the hearth had burned down to its last orange breath, and June Carter sat beside it, blanket over her knees, not for warmth, but for the weight. She hadn't spoken much in 3 days. She'd eaten, yes, and even helped fold laundry with a kind of quiet diligence. But the girl who once looked at Leandro Donovan with frightened eyes now looked at the fire instead, as if she could see a version of herself in the flames, some fragile ember she hoped hadn't gone out. Leandro stood at the counter pouring coffee that neither of them really needed. He watched her, not like a man watching a woman, but like a man watching the moment right before a deer bolts. "You ever been to Valdero?" she asked suddenly. The question fell into the room like a stone into water, rippled silence afterward. He answered without turning. "Passed through once. Dusty town. Mean men in silk shirts." June smiled faintly. "That's the one." She reached into the folds of the blanket, pulled out a folded paper. A page from a ledger. She unfolded it like she'd done it 100 times, creases worn white from memory. On it was a number scrawled in red ink, and a name. Ricardo Almaraz. "I used to think names had power," she said. "Turns out some names just hurt more when you remember them." Leandro sat across from her. He didn't ask where she got it, didn't ask what she planned to do with it. He just looked at the fire the same way she did and let the silence sit. "I had a brother once," she whispered. "Lyle. He was older, used to make up songs when I had night terrors. Mama called him my anchor." She swallowed hard. "He died in that same town. Got in the way of a debt that wasn't his. And Daddy just stepped over him, like he was trash blown across the porch." Her fingers clenched the paper. "I didn't cry, not when they buried him. Not when the preacher said Lyle had served his purpose. That's what they said about him. A purpose." Leandro's voice was soft. "And you?" June turned her face. "I was the repayment." The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a bird took off its wings, cutting clean through morning. "My daddy's got a voice like syrup," she said. "Sweet, slow, and full of poison. When he gave me to Rigo, he smiled at me. He said, 'Now be useful for once, won't you?'" That broke something in the room. Leandro's knuckles went white around his coffee mug. He looked up at her not with pity, but with a fury he kept under skin. He didn't say it, but she saw it. He would have killed the man with his bare hands if he'd been there. But June shook her head. "Don't feel sorry. That's how they win. When you pity me, it means I'm still that girl in the dirt." He leaned back. "What are you now?" She met his gaze. "I'm what they didn't plan on. I'm alive." Then came the knock. Not loud, not urgent, but wrong. Leandro Rose slowly moved to the door, his hand hovering near the pistol that always hung just above the stove. When he opened it, a man in a black hat with snakeskin boots stood there chewing a toothpick like it was a sermon. Well, now the man drawled, "Ain't this cozy?" Leandro said nothing. June stood behind him, shoulders straight. The man's eyes flicked to her and lit up with recognition. "Miss Carter," he said, tipping his hat. "Your daddy's been looking for you." "No, he hasn't," June replied, steady. "He's been looking for what he lost his leverage." The man chuckled. "Well, now he's got himself a new problem. Owes more than you're worth. And now folks think the man who saved you took his money too." He looked at Leandro. "That be you?" Leandro didn't flinch. "Tell whoever sent you I don't run. And I don't forget faces." The man spat the toothpick into the dirt. "Ain't about running, it's about settling debts." He turned, but not before whispering to June. "Best start writing your will, sweetheart. The past has a long reach, especially when it wears boots." When he was gone, June collapsed onto the porch rail, her breath ragged. "I thought I was done running," she said. Leandro stared out at the road. "You are?" "We're not running." She looked up. "You mean to fight them?" He turned to her. "No, I mean to finish it." June's lip trembled, but her eyes were dry. She reached into her blouse and pulled out a necklace, plain silver, unadorned. She took it off and placed it in his palm. "It was my mama's. She wore it the night she stood between my daddy and the belt." Leandro closed his fingers around it. "She said one thing to me that I've never forgotten," June whispered. "She said, they don't win unless you let them teach you to hate." He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, she didn't look like someone barely surviving. She looked like someone remembering how to stand. The fire came just after dusk. It wasn't the kind that crackled in the hearth or gave comfort to cold hands. It was the kind that swallowed silence, the kind that didn't knock before it burst in. They came on horseback, 4 men silent, as dusk itself, faces wrapped in cloth rifles slung loose like lazy wolves. The dry wind of the desert kicked up dust behind them, a reddish veil that blurred the edges of what was real and what was about to be broken. Leandro had been sharpening a knife on the porch when he felt it, not the sound, but the stillness. Like the land held its breath. He stood slow without panic and looked out past the corral. His eyes narrowed, not from fear, but recognition. Old ghosts had their own gait, and he knew the way violence approached, without hurry, without conscience. Inside the cabin, Isabel was folding linens. She didn't hear them until the first gunshot tore through the front post, splintering wood just inches from where Leandro had stood. He didn't flinch. Instead, he ducked behind the saddle rack, drew the Colt from under the floorboard with a familiarity that betrayed no hesitation, and for a moment, the war returned. The second shot came faster. This one hit the water barrel, bursting it open like a wound. Inside, Isabel dropped the sheet and ran to the back room, heart rattling against her ribs like a bird too long in a cage. Leandro moved like breath over coals, quiet, purposeful, without wasting a step. He fired once. A man screamed. The desert echoed. Then came the silence again. That sharp, waiting silence that always follows blood. By the time it was over, 3 men lay scattered like broken furniture. The 4th was gone, fled into the dusk with a wound in his shoulder and a name burning in his memory. "Rigo sends his regards," one of the dying men had spat before choking on his own breath. Leandro stood over him, gaze unreadable. The gun in his hand didn't tremble. But something inside him did. Inside, Isabel sat on the floor by the stove knees, pulled to her chest, her face blank hollow. Her hands were red, not from blood, but from pressing too hard, holding too tight. Leandro knelt beside her. He sent them, she said flatly. He didn't ask who, didn't need to. She looked at him, her voice thin as thread. How many men have you killed, Leandro? He paused, not out of shame, but out of reverence, enough to know the weight never leaves you. She nodded, once, then looked down at her hands. You move like it's all muscle memory. Like your soul knows how to aim before your eyes do. A beat passed. He said quietly, It's not something I'm proud of, but I won't let them take you. The room held that truth in its bones. The cabin, the walls, even the dried herbs above the stove, they all knew now he was no longer hiding. Later that night, Isabel sat by the fire, this one gentle crackling inside the hearth. She was wrapped in Leandro's old wool coat, though the evening wasn't cold. Her body remembered fear before her skin could argue otherwise. He brought her a cup of black tea. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But after a while she whispered, The last time I saw fire, it was under my feet. In Valdemora, when they beat another girl half to death for refusing a man. They made us watch. They burned her skirts. She didn't scream. Leandro sat across from her, his face as still as stone. Do you know what it's like? She continued, to watch someone become less than human, and to wonder if you'll be next, or if you'll envy her for escaping. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he knew too well. Outside the wind shifted. Inside something else did too. Leandro leaned forward. You're not less Isabel. Not for what they did. Not for surviving it. She looked at him, eyes rimmed in old bruises and older silence. And you, she asked. What are you not less of, Leandro Ruiz? He blinked slowly. A tired smile crossed his face. I'm not less of a man for walking away from the name they gave me. El Filo de Teruel. That was never who I wanted to be. Just who they needed me to become. She nodded. Then said almost gently, They'll keep coming, won't they? He met her gaze steady. Yes. Her breath shook, but her voice didn't. Then, teach me. He raised a brow. To shoot, she said. To run if I have to, or not run if I don't want to anymore. For a long moment the air between them was thick with something unspoken. Not romance. Not yet. Something fiercer. Older. Recognition. He reached into the drawer, pulled out an old revolver, and set it gently in her hands. It's heavier than it looks, he said. So am I, she whispered. By midnight the bodies had been buried. The blood scrubbed, the doors barred, but inside that cabin 2 souls sat by the fire, one mending, one remembering. Both marked, neither broken. The world outside would not forgive them. It would not forget them. But they were no longer asking it to, because forgiveness wasn't what they needed. They needed each other. And in the quiet between the wind and the fire, something rare happened. He looked at her not as something to save, and she looked at him not as something to fear. And though neither of them said the words, it was the first time since Valdemora she felt like she wasn't alone in the room. The night fell slow that evening, like a curtain pulled by tired hands. Inside the worn-out cabin, June sat near the stove, her palms hovering above a pot of boiling water. The steam curled around her wrists, fogging the cracked glass window, just enough to soften the view of the empty corral outside. She'd washed the blood from Leandro's shirt herself, folded it twice. Didn't ask where the stain came from, because she already knew. He hadn't come inside yet. The door creaked only once, and there he was, taller than the dark behind him, shoulders heavy with dust, and something older than exhaustion. He placed his hat on the peg, leaned his rifle against the wall, and stood still like the kind of man who no longer believed in sitting. You hungry? She asked, voice small as thread. He shook his head. His eyes lingered on her face, as if seeing it in a new way, and perhaps he was. June turned back to the pot. I've been thinking a lot about names. Leandro didn't move. She continued. My mama gave me June, 'cause she said the world looked kindest in June. Said it reminded her of light after the hard frost. But that name don't feel like mine no more. Leandro stepped closer, slow. The floorboards whispered beneath his boots. I was someone's daughter, she said. Then I was someone's debt. Then nothing at all. He wanted to speak, but she didn't give him the space. Rigo called me girl, or worse. The girls at the brothel called me ghost, since I didn't scream, didn't cry. Just sat there like I was already gone. She turned to him now, and her eyes were bone dry but burning. So I want to ask you something, and I need you to tell me plain. He nodded. Who are you? Really, Leandro Ruiz had forgotten how to answer that question. He pulled out a wooden chair, turned it backward, and sat down with his forearms resting across the back. His voice was sandpaper when it came. Name used to be Leon. Leon El Silencio. Folks called me that, 'cause I never spoke before I shot. June didn't flinch, but something in her chest curled. I was 17 when I first killed a man, he continued. Wasn't clean, wasn't noble, just messy and loud and permanent. After that, I kept killing for money, for mercy, for revenge, for nothing at all. One day I looked at my hands and didn't know who they belonged to. He paused, watching her. I ran, changed my name, changed my story, told myself if I stopped saying who I was, maybe I'd stop being it. The wind moaned against the roof. June stared at her hands, remembering how they used to tremble when she was touched. They didn't now. You saved me, she whispered. No, he said. I just carried you out of the dirt. You did the saving after that. Silence fell between them, thick as raw honey. She stood up slowly as if her bones remembered every bruise, walked to the old chest in the corner and lifted the lid. From inside, she pulled out her father's Bible, the only thing she took when she left his house. She laid it flat on the table between them. I used to think names were gifts, she said. Turns out some are just branding irons. He looked up at her. I don't want the name he gave me, she said. I want to choose who I am now. Leandro's voice was quieter than it had ever been. Then choose it. She didn't blink. But I want you to call it first. What? She stepped closer. Whatever you see in me now, whatever's left after the selling, the silence, the dirt, I want you to speak it. He studied her like a man studies a sunrise after 20 years underground. I see Alma, he said. She blinked. He continued, means soul. Not the body that was sold, not the pain that was taken. What's underneath? What's still yours? June breathed out like a burden falling from an invisible place inside her. Then, that's who I'll be. The next morning she rose early, washed her face in the rain barrel, braided her hair for the first time in months. There was something clean about the gesture, not vanity, but reclamation. They sat on the porch with coffee in tin mugs, boots resting on the worn step, watching a line of birds vanish into the pink sky. You ever wish you could take it all back? She asked. No, he said. She turned to him, surprised. He sipped slow. Wishin' means thinking it should have gone different. Truth is, it didn't. And maybe it brought you to the porch. Maybe that's enough. She reached over, fingers curling lightly around his. I don't hate my father, she said. I don't think I can ever love him again. But I don't want to carry him anymore. You won't, Leandro said. That's the cost of a name, Alma. Sometimes, it's just learning how to leave it behind. And just like that, she leaned her head against his shoulder. There was no music, no final word. just the morning light warming her eyelids and the weight of his breath steady as the world. They didn't need to speak of what was coming next, but somewhere deep inside both of them, beyond the blood, beyond the fear, there was room now for something that hadn't lived in years. A name not given, not taken, but chosen. The desert wind had teeth that morning, sharp and dry, like a gambler's breath after a long night of losing. Leandro Ruiz sat outside the cabin with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He wasn't drinking it, just holding it like maybe the warmth would climb back into his fingers if he gave it enough time. But warmth had been a rare visitor lately. Inside, Isabel moved slowly. Her boots brushed against the worn floorboards, soft and steady, like she was afraid of waking the ghosts that clung to every corner of the house. Maybe they were already awake. Leandro hadn't told her about the telegram. Not yet. He folded it again, creased down the center, like a wound too old to bleed. Joaquin Rivas owes 280 silver pesos. Past due. Final warning, collect or eliminate. Los hermanos de sangre. They weren't subtle. They weren't liars either. That afternoon, Isabel found him saddling the horse he never took out unless he expected trouble. "Where are you going?" Her voice had a steadiness that made his hands pause. There was something hardening in her lately, not anger, but clarity. Leandro didn't look up, just down to Zorita for supplies. On that saddle. He looked at her now, really looked. The bruises were gone from her face, but some things still ached beneath the skin. She stepped closer. "What's happened?" He handed her the telegram without a word. She read it once, then again slower. Her hands didn't shake. When she finally spoke, her voice had the edge of someone who had cried all her tears in previous chapters of her life. "He sold me for one debt. Now he's gambling with your life to cover another." By sunset, the road out of town was empty except for dust and memory. They found Joaquin in Valdemora, slumped over a table with whiskey breath and a black eye swelling like a second mouth trying to confess. The cantina was dim, all shadows, and the smell of sour sweat. Leandro stood behind Isabel as she stepped into the room, a storm in boots. Joaquin looked up and actually flinched. "Mija." She didn't answer. She just stared at him, her mouth firm, her eyes two flintstones. One of the debt collectors sat nearby, a thin man in a linen vest, picking dirt from under his fingernails with a knife. He glanced up when Leandro entered. Recognition sparked. Disrespect followed. "Well, well," the man drawled. "Didn't think you'd bring the girl back here. Thought she'd be dead by now like the others." Isabel spoke before Leandro could. "I'm not dead, just tired of being traded like bad luck." Joaquin tried to stand. Failed. "Isabel, listen to me." "No." Her voice was soft. Too soft. "I listened when I was 13. When you said Mama died because God was cruel and you couldn't help it. When you told me I had to be strong while you drank away the house. I listened when you said you'd win it all back. And again, when you told me the man at the door just needed a favor. I listened, Papa. But this," she held up the telegram. "This is where I stop." Leandro leaned one hand against the bar, calm as dusk. "You told them I had the money." The debt collector stood, taller than expected, the kind of tall that didn't come with kindness. "That's what the old man said," he smirked. "Said you took his daughter and his coin. Said you ran." Leandro blinked slow. "You believe every drunk who can't pay. We don't get paid to believe," the man replied. "We get paid to finish." A silence fell so dense even the flies stopped buzzing. Then Isabel whispered, "Do you remember Mama's hands?" Papa Joaquin blinked. "What?" "They were rough, from washing, from sewing, but they were never cruel." "I remember that. She used to tuck my hair behind my ears and say, You're not your father's shame. You're your mother's strength. Joaquin looked like he'd been shot and hadn't noticed yet. I'm not here to curse you, she said, but I will never protect you again. The debt collector raised his gun. Too slow. Leandro moved like time bent around him, faster than grief, sharper than memory. 2 shots, one to the man's shoulder, one to the lamp above. The room filled with smoke and glass. By the time anyone could see again, Leandro had his Colt leveled and steady. His voice was low. You try to touch her again, and I don't miss on purpose. They left Joaquin there, not dead, not saved, just left, like he'd left her. Later that night, back at the cabin, Isabel sat at the edge of the bed, her shoulders turned inward, like they might collapse. Leandro poured her tea. I didn't kill him, he said softly. She looked up. I know. I wanted to. I know that too. A long silence stretched between them. Then she asked, Do you think he ever loved me? Leandro didn't answer right away. Finally he said, I think he didn't know how to love anyone who reminded him of what he lost. She nodded, slow. Mama loved, even when it cost her. That's the only kind that matters. Another pause. She took the tea, sipped it. Then, for the first time in weeks, she reached out and touched his hand. Thank you, she whispered. Not for saving her, not for shooting the man, just for staying. And Leandro, who had been so many things in his life, ghost legend, fugitive guardian, said the only words that ever really counted. You're not something to be traded, Isabel. Not anymore. Outside, the wind had quieted. Inside, for the first time in a long time, 2 people slept without keeping one eye open. The wind blew hard across the scrubland, sharp and restless, as if the earth itself could sense what was coming. Leandro had taken the bullet to his left shoulder, just past the dry arroyo. The shot rang out so sudden, so final, it split the sky in 2. He didn't scream, just staggered backward, like a man who'd known pain before, and didn't see the point in giving it more power. Isabel had fired back before she even knew she was moving. She wasn't thinking of where she stood, only that he'd gone down. There were 3 men. Only one made it out alive, and even he left part of himself behind in the dirt. The old church came into view like a secret no one had told in years. Half-collapsed roof, sagging vines growing up where bells used to ring. She helped him, embracing his weight with her shoulder, her mouth dry and eyes too clear. He wouldn't let her light a fire. They'll see it, he whispered, teeth clenched. Let the cold do its work. His blood was dark and sticky against her hands. She pressed a cloth tight to the wound. It made her think of the first time she'd bled when she was 15, and thought it meant she was a woman. No one had told her it also meant men would stop seeing her as a child. She sat beside him as he lay on a makeshift altar of stone, the blood pooling under him like a kind of offering. You should have left me behind, he said. She didn't answer. Hours passed. The silence got thick, like cotton soaked in whiskey. Somewhere an owl called. A storm brewed out beyond the hills. I've killed men before, he said into the dark, not looking at her. Plenty. Isabel folded his coat under his head. I know. He chuckled dry. Thought that'd scare you. She met his eyes steady. I think the world should be more scared of the men who don't kill when they should. When she finally slept curled beside him on the stone, she dreamed of her father. He was younger in the dream. Not the pale-eyed ghost he'd become, but the man who once sang her lullabies in a voice soaked in whiskey and smoke. The man who taught her to shuffle cards and told her to always hide an ace up her sleeve. She'd trusted him, even as he signed her away on a napkin with numbers and initials. Even when he said, "It's not forever, Mija. Just until I catch another break." Even when he didn't come back. She woke before dawn. The wound had stopped bleeding, but not aching. Leandro was watching her. His eyes held that quiet pain only soldiers and children of drunks ever carried. "I should have taken you north," he said, "to the convent in Valverde. You'd be safe there." She touched his jaw rough with days of dust and regret. "And if I wanted to be safe," she said, "I'd have married the butcher's son in Tierra Roja." He laughed soft and surprised, like it had snuck up on him. "You'd have been miserable." She nodded. "Every day." They didn't kiss. Not then. Not in the candlelit hush of that ruined place. But something passed between them, not love, not yet, just the unspoken knowing that he was no longer just the man who saved her, and she was no longer the girl left for dead. By mid-morning, they'd buried the two men they'd killed. She watched him dig with one arm, sweat streaking through blood and dirt, and thought, he doesn't need anyone to forgive him. But maybe he needs someone who won't ask him to. She wrapped the bodies in torn cloth, not because they deserved it, but because she did. "I won't become like them," she whispered more to herself than him. That night, as they shared dry cornbread and silence, he said, "There's more coming." She nodded. "I know. They won't stop. I won't either." He stared at her for a long time, then eyes dark with something older than violence. "I used to think I'd die alone, that it'd be easier." She looked up from her hands, and now he didn't smile. But he didn't look away. "Now I'm afraid of what happens to you if I do." In the final light of the day, she walked outside to where the dry grass bent in the wind like a field of ghosts. She thought of the man who'd made her, then sold her, of the men who'd touched her without asking, of the bruises that had faded from her skin but stayed under her fingernails, and she thought of Leandro, the way he never touched her without permission, the way he bled without complaint, the way he let her stay silent when silence was the only thing keeping her whole. She whispered it aloud for the wind alone to hear. "You were never a monster, but you are the kind of man worth killing for." Back inside, Leandro had drifted into a half-sleep. She knelt beside him, brushing sweat from his brow. And in the hush between thunder and dawn, he murmured, "And you, Isabel, you're the kind of woman who makes dying feel like mercy." They didn't talk again that night. They didn't need to, because there are words heavier than bullets, and there are silences softer than any prayer. And sometimes healing doesn't come with music or miracles. It comes with a shared wound, a stitched shoulder, and the quiet, stubborn choice to keep walking beside someone even when the road is broken. The dawn broke in pieces that morning, clouds like old parchment torn by wind. Sky streaked pale with doubt. June rode behind Luke, arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek resting against his back. She hadn't said a word in hours. The road to El Paso stretched like a vein across the land, pulsing with every hoofbeat, every memory they'd tried to outrun. They'd left behind the cabin, the safety, the hush of half-formed trust. Now it was only them, a dusty mare, and a debt of blood to be reckoned. Luke didn't speak either. He let the silence breathe between them, same way you let an old wound breathe, so it won't rot underneath the bandage. But something in his posture had changed, stiffer, heavier, like he was riding not just toward danger, but back into a name he buried years ago. The name people whispered. The Viper. They stopped at a dried-up riverbed by noon. June dismounted without help, her legs steady now. She walked a few paces, stared out over the brittle brush and sun-bleached bones of what used to be life. Then quietly she said, "If he looks me in the eye, I don't know if I'll scream or forgive him." Luke poured water into a tin cup, handed it to her. "You don't owe him either," he said. "I owe myself," she whispered. He nodded. That night, camped beneath the broken ribs of a canyon ridge, Luke finally told her. "They called me the Viper," he said, staring into the fire, not because I was fast, but because I didn't miss. One shot, one breath. That's all I gave them. June looked up from her blanket face, lit in orange flicker. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held questions she hadn't dared form until now. How many did you kill? He didn't answer, not with a number, only this, enough to forget who I was, not enough to forgive what they did. She didn't flinch, just watched the fire crackle the way a child watches thunder and learns not to fear it. You stopped, for a while. Why he looked at her, then really looked. And the answer came like something too old to lie about, because I got tired of being feared. I wanted to be missed. El Paso came into view 2 days later, dusty and sun-scabbed with roofs leaning like old men and windows squinting against the heat. June sat straighter in the saddle, every breath sharper. She wore a plain blue dress, now the color of storm-washed cornflowers, and boots that didn't fit quite right. But she rode like a woman who'd survived something most wouldn't. Luke pointed toward a ridge above the city. There's an old livery barn there, safe for the night. Tomorrow you choose how this ends. June turned her face to his, and for a moment, her voice caught somewhere between gratitude and dread. What if I'm not ready? Luke shrugged softly. Then we ride on, and never look back. But she looked down at her hands, once broken, now strong again. No. I think I need to see what's left of him to know it's smaller than what's left of me. The saloon hadn't changed, not a single plank of wood, not the oil lamp over the corner table, nor the dent in the wall where a bottle had once shattered the night her father lost her. It all felt too intact, like time had honored the wrong things. Her father was there, old, thinner, his beard patchier than she remembered, but still playing cards with a grin, like he'd never been touched by consequence. He looked up, froze. For a moment, the only sound was the shuffle of a dealer's deck and the screech of a chair backing away from nothing. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. Figured they'd dumped your corpse in a canyon. June stepped forward, her boots slow and even on the warped floor. You almost got your wish. He leaned back in his chair, lit a match, and chewed on a toothpick, like truth didn't belong in this room. What do you want, girl? Apology. I saved your skin far as I'm concerned. Paid off my debts with what I had. June didn't blink. You had a daughter. His chuckle was dry sharp. Had a damn gambling streak, too. Can't feed two hungers at once. Luke appeared in the doorway. One hand rested near his holster. He didn't speak, didn't move. Just stood there like a shadow watching for fire. June stepped closer, placed a tiny tin box on the table. It was her mother's blue enamel chipped filled with old thread and one gold wedding ring. She stayed after you hit her. I stayed after you traded me. But this, she tapped the lid. This is what's left of loyalty. Take it, bury it, or drink it. I'm done. The old man looked at the box. His hand twitched, but he didn't open it. June turned, walked toward the door, past Luke, past the gawking faces and the stilled piano. But just before she left, she stopped, looked over her shoulder. By the way, she said softly, they didn't break me. You did. But I put myself back together. That means I'm mine now. Outside, the sun had begun to slip behind the hills. Luke offered her the reins. She didn't take them. Instead, she walked beside him. No words. But something passed between them in the silence. Something like mercy, or maybe just the final stitch in a wound finally closed. And as they disappeared over the ridge, the wind carried only this: the sound of hooves, and the weight of a name no longer needed. The saloon in El Paso hadn't changed. Not the dust caked along the banisters, not the smell of old tobacco and desperation, not even the sound of worn-out laughter that covered deeper things. Some places rot in place, This one had. June Carter stood in the doorway, like a memory returning home, not to be welcomed, but to be reckoned with. Her dress was simple, worn at the seams. Her boots had walked too far to look new, but she held herself steady like a stone in a flood. Inside, at the far table beneath the cracked mirror and broken clock, he sat. Carter Sr. hunched over cards and cheap whiskey the same way he had the night he sold her. Leandro Ruiz hovered just behind her shoulder. Quiet, alert, as always, not leading, not saving, just standing where a good man stands when a woman walks towards something she shouldn't have to face alone. "Wait here," she said, her voice barely louder than breath. He nodded once. June stepped forward. The room did not turn silent. This wasn't the kind of place that respected silence. But one man did look up. Rigo Almaraz, seated across from her father, still in his slick black coat and bolo tie, the wolf who thought he'd eaten the lamb. She didn't flinch. She walked until she stood by that table. Carter Sr. squinted at her. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, not recognition, not guilt. Something smaller. Inconvenience. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, leaning back. "Thought you were dead, girl." June laid her hand on the table. Slowly from the pocket of her coat, she took out a small wooden box. Opened it. Inside was her mother's wedding ring, the only thing she had kept hidden in her boot the night she was dragged away. She placed it on the table gently. "This," she said, "is what you traded me for." Her father chuckled. "I traded you for a hell of a lot more than that. You were worth $5,000 that night, least until you started fighting back. I was 16. 16 and mouthy. Don't act like you were some saint." He leaned forward. "You think the world owes you now, 'cause you made it out. You're lucky, girl. Lucky he didn't kill you and bury you in the sand." June blinked. Once. Rigo Almaraz was watching her like a hawk. His smile was patient, but his fingers tapped slow and ready against the butt of the pistol on his belt. "I didn't come for revenge," she said. No, Rigo's voice slid through the room like oil. "Then what's this little show about guilt-tripping?" Daddy June looked down at the ring, then at the cards, then finally into her father's eyes. "I came to tell you," she said, "that I forgive you." He laughed, loud, ugly. "Forgive me," he spat. "You think I give a damn about your forgiveness? You're not some holy woman. You're a used-up piece I lost in a game, that's all." June's hands didn't move, but Leandro did. One slow step forward, Rigo noticed. His smile curled. "Easy, cowboy," he warned. "We all got blood on our hands here. Some of us just wear it better." June turned to Rigo then, and this time her voice was colder. "You didn't win me. You stole years. But you don't own what's left." Rigo smirked. "You got pretty words, girl, but I still remember how you screamed." That's when Leandro moved. One shot, clean, quiet. The bullet lodged in the table beside Rigo's hand, not in it, not through it. A message, not a murder. The saloon stilled. Finally. Leandro's voice cut through the smoke like gravel dragged across stone. "You say one more word like that, and I won't miss next time." Rigo froze, calculating, and for the first time perhaps realizing the man beside her wasn't just some dusty drifter. June bent down, picked up the ring, slipped it on her pinky finger. "I forgive you," she said again, this time to her father. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to live without hating you anymore." He didn't reply, didn't even blink, because some men rot so slowly they forget what life smells like. She walked away, past the broken mirror, past the sticky bar where she once watched him gamble her name, past Rigo, whose hand still trembled slightly beneath the table, out into the street, into the dust and dying light. Leandro followed. They rode until the town was a smudge on the horizon. Neither spoke. Then, as dusk fell behind the hills, June finally whispered, "I didn't know if I could do that." Leandro, reins loose in hand, said softly, "You didn't go there to fight, June. You went there to finish." She nodded, then smiled. Not wide, just enough for her eyes to soften. I think she said I finally heard my mother's voice again, just for a moment, like she was proud of me. And he didn't answer. He just reached over, touched the back of her hand, the one still wearing the ring, and held it until the wind carried them forward into night. The ground was dry where they buried him. No one cried. There were no hymns, no prayers. Just the sound of a shovel scraping dirt, and the wind whispering through the scrub trees, like it wanted to say something, but didn't quite know how. Leandro stood with the weight of the sun on his back, a leather glove clenched in his fist. June was beside him, motionless, except for the rise and fall of her breath, too quiet, too steady, like she'd trained herself not to feel anything at all. Her father lay 6 feet below in a pine box he never paid for, and yet somehow, even in death, he felt owed. "That's it then," Leandro murmured, voice low as dust. June didn't answer. She was watching the flame at the end of her cigarette, not smoking it, just watching it die. It was the first time she'd seen her father in years, and the last. They hadn't planned to bury him. In truth, Leandro had suggested they leave the body where it fell in that backroom saloon where the man had tried to sell out his own blood for a second time. But June had stood over him for a long while silent, before saying, "No man's memory should be left in a puddle." She didn't speak of forgiveness, not once. Only closure, and even that sounded like a borrowed word, something she didn't quite believe in. The ride to the old Carter land was quiet. The house was gone, burned in some dispute over taxes years ago. All that remained was a rusted gate and a patch of dry cottonwood that hadn't bloomed in decades. Here, June had said, "This is far enough from the road." They dug the hole themselves. At dusk, after the last shovelful of dirt was patted down and the sun began leaking red across the horizon, Leandro stepped back and gave her space. June crouched down slowly, as if her knees still remembered being kicked. She placed something on the fresh earth, a bundle of folded papers, old and yellowed. The deeds, the original promissory notes, and the letter he'd written to the brothel owner the night he sold her. None of it trembled in her hands. She struck a match and set the corner of the bundle on fire. The paper curled instantly, blackening, hissing. She didn't look away. Leandro finally asked softly, "What was that last one?" June's eyes didn't move. Her voice came flat. "The letter where he called me an asset." The flame crackled. He wrote that I'd give them no trouble, that I was obedient, quiet, good with men. She paused. I was 17. Leandro shut his eyes for a moment. The silence pressed against them like heat. "He used to read to me when I was little," she said, voice tight now, like it was fighting something back. "Bible verses, stories about kings and deserts and widows who never gave up. And I believed him." She stood. "I believed I was worth more than a hand of cards." Her gaze turned to Leandro, then not looking for comfort, but looking for truth. Was I wrong? He didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked to his horse, pulled something from the saddlebag, and came back with a small leather box. Inside, it was a ring, gold thin, with an emerald set like a teardrop in its center. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it until the day they dragged her away." He handed it to her without ceremony, just a small nod. "You weren't wrong, June. You were just betrayed before you had the words to name it." She held the ring in her palm for a long time. Then finally she said, "I don't want to carry his name anymore." Leandro didn't flinch. "You don't have to." She looked out over the land that once belonged to her bloodline, now just a patch of silence and sunburned dirt. What do you think happens to a name when no one wants it anymore? He answered without pause. It burns. That night, they slept by the fire, not in bed, not in a house, but under the stars, the same way they had when they were running. She couldn't sleep, and he didn't try to make her. Instead, he took out his harmonica, the one he never played, and finally gave it voice. The tune was old, something from Andalusia maybe, or New Mexico. It sounded like train smoke and goodbyes, and things left unsaid. June listened. She didn't cry, but her shoulders relaxed just slightly. And when the last note faded, she whispered, "I think he's still somewhere, waiting for me to ask for something. And I think tonight's the first night I don't care." Leandro didn't say a word, but he reached for her hand and she let him take it. For the first time, she let him hold it, without needing to be strong. Just two souls sitting in the ashes of names that no longer mattered, learning in that quiet space between one fire and the next, that healing doesn't shout. It listens. The morning came soft and gold over the ridge, the kind of light that didn't demand anything from you, just offered its presence like a hand held out in silence. June Carter stood on the front porch of the adobe house, bare feet pressed against the cool stone, a chipped mug of chicory coffee resting warm in her hands. The horizon no longer frightened her. It had been 1 year since they laid her father in the earth. 1 year since Luke Donovan set down his revolver for the last time and picked up a hammer instead. The land around them had been dry, then cracked and hollow as her heart. Now wildflowers crept up the hills like they had somewhere to be. Behind her, the house stirred with slow sounds, the clink of pots, the creak of wood, a girl laughing softly from the back room. This wasn't a shelter. Not exactly. Luke called it La Posada de los Corazones Rotos, the Inn of Broken Hearts. A place for women like June. A place for girls who'd been sold, bruised, forgotten. A place where mercy wasn't a gift. It was a choice made every single day. Inside, Esperanza was showing a little girl how to lace her boots. The child couldn't have been more than 6, but her hands already trembled when someone raised their voice. June didn't ask questions. She'd stopped doing that. When the women came at dawn under stars through the back gate, they only needed one thing to not be turned away. "She asked if we have a bell for the front door," Esperanza whispered as June entered. "And what did you tell her? That we don't lock doors here, and we don't ring bells for grace." The morning passed with chores, laughter, and slices of fresh pan dulce made by a woman who used to sew corsets in the red light quarter of El Paso. June fixed a window hinge that had been whining since winter, while Luke repaired a broken saddle with a tenderness no one would expect from a man once called the Viper. He no longer spoke of the war, no longer flinched when someone touched his shoulder, but in his quiet there were whole volumes of regret shelved neatly behind his blue eyes. That evening, just before sunset, a man came riding up the hill, dust-covered, broad-shouldered hat pulled low, the kind of man who didn't smile when he saw you, but looked at you like he was measuring what you had left to lose. June stiffened. Luke stepped out from the barn, wiping oil from his hands. "Name's Arturo Mendez," the man said. "I'm here for someone named Isabel." June narrowed her eyes. "There's no Isabel here. Her father said she was living with some cowboy, said you were keeping her from paying her debt." Luke didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. The silence around him did all the talking. June stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut clear through the dusk. "Her name's not Isabel anymore, and she doesn't owe a damn thing." Arturo looked at Luke, then back at her. "You think you can build a new life out here, paint over what's been done?" June's voice didn't crack. "No, But we can build something that doesn't need to hide. He spat in the dust. Ain't how the world works, lady. Luke took one step forward. Just one. Then it's a good thing we stopped asking the world for permission. Later that night, June found the little girl sitting by the kitchen hearth, fingering a string of prayer beads someone had left on the windowsill. She was whispering to herself in Spanish words too quiet to catch. June knelt beside her. Do you want to tell me what you're saying? The girl shook her head, but leaned into her. You don't have to talk, June whispered. Not if it still hurts. The girl looked up. Will I ever not be scared? June smiled then. Not big, not proud. Just soft. The kind that carried ache and survival in the same breath. There are days it still shakes me, she said. But then I touch the earth, or hear someone laugh in the garden, or smell bread baking, and I remember I'm still here. And that means I'm not done yet. Later, Luke lit a lantern out by the stable. June joined him, a shawl around her shoulders. She was right, you know, she said. That man. We can't paint over it. He didn't look up, just tied a knot in the saddle strap and spoke low. No, but we can build new walls with old stone. She watched him for a while, then said, I was afraid for a long time that I'd always belong to what was done to me. Luke finally looked at her, and now June's eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something quieter. Now I belong to what I choose to build. At dawn, a letter arrived. No name, no return address, just a single folded page. June opened it at the table. It read, I know what I did, and I know it can't be undone. But if you found something better than me, then maybe I did one thing right. J.C. June didn't speak. She folded the page and burned it over the sink. Luke watched her from the doorway. What did it say? Nothing I didn't already know, she said. In the weeks that followed, more women arrived. One brought her baby. One brought only a scar. One didn't speak at all for a month. June greeted them each the same, with hands open, voice calm, and food waiting. And every time someone asked what this place was, she'd smile and say, It's not a shelter. It's not a church. It's just a house that Mercy built. And you don't need to be good to be welcome here. You just need to be ready to begin again,